Now, Currere is a method that William Pienaar developed, and most of the work or the ideas that I'm talking about are taken from his book, What is Curriculum Theory? Since then, I've realized, I think in the 1970s, he actually wrote another text that had more information related to Currere, but my understandings have come from that particular book. So any page numbers or quotes that I've used are from that book unless otherwise stated. And I've actually written out most of this presentation, but I'll try not to just verbatim read my work. We'll see if I can get through it. It's still a bit fresh, so I'm not quite sure where I'm going with things. First thing I wanted to talk about is why I'm considering the method of Currere for my doctoral dissertation. It's a method designed to encourage the learner to reflect on the past, the future, and the consequences for the present. And what I've found is it centers on experiences, which I've found very helpful because it's my experiences that have brought me to my research interest, and it's my experiences that help me continue to formulate and generate research ideas. And submerged in what is the past and the future tend to become absorbed in the present, and they can disappear, and I don't want to unconsciously be submerged in the present. I want to learn to challenge and disrupt my present ways of thinking, especially my Western worldview. So what is the problem within or that is my present, or why am I choosing this type of research? And I've got a couple of examples I'd like to share. Basically, I'm finding that I was drawn to Indigenous ways of knowing for a variety of reasons. One being it relates to complex thinking and complexity thinking. It's very relational in understanding, not reductionistic like Western thinking. And what I've found with the mathematics curriculum is that most of the additions of Aboriginal content tend to be token additions, and Aboriginal knowledges aren't even included, especially in mathematics. So I have an example I'd like to share with you besides the curriculum indicator that's there. If you just take a look on page 155. There's an introduction that relates acute triangles to First Nations and Métis cultures. And in particular, it was point A that sort of got me thinking that I didn't like how this question was worded. It says, design a teepee, choose the number of poles, the interior height, and the diameter of the base. And similarly, in this curriculum outcome and indicator, you'll note that it's indicator J, which means it's actually at the bottom of the indicators, and in fact it's the last indicator. And I find again, with most Aboriginal content, it tends to get thrown towards the end so that it sort of seems optional, and maybe teachers, I assume, can gloss over it and move forward. But what it says specifically is determine the slopes of the poles in a teepee and the impact of changing the slopes and dimensions. So the reason why these two things started to bother me is I actually had an opportunity to take a course over at First Nations University, and Angelina Weenie was one of my teachers, along with Willie Ermine. And what I found was, as I was learning more about Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ways of knowing, that these questions started to bother me even more, because none of the Aboriginal knowledge about teepee poles and their teachings are actually offered or talked about. They're completely absent. So what I came to start to understand was there's an absent presence that exists in the curriculum and in curriculum documents such as textbooks. Things are mentioned, but Aboriginal knowledge itself is absent from the scenario. So I want to be able to critique these ways of knowing, or my present ways of knowing, which are Western worldview, and I want to be able to challenge Western worldview. And I already mentioned this about the absent presence that seems to exist. And I believe education can help with reconciliation. Every school, according to Baptiste, is either a site of reproduction or a site of change. And each educator has a role or responsibility in changing her and her own students' conceptions about First Nations students' heritage and contributions. So this is the type of work that I'm trying to practice. And one question is, how does Currere relate to these types of ideas? Well, Currere is influenced by literary and feminist theory. It's a method for considering education as self-formation through academic study. And so what I've found is my own doctoral experiences are actually changing the way I think about myself as an educator. And that's why I relate to Currere, because I do find that there's this self-formation or a shift happening. I'd actually like to point out that I don't necessarily agree with Pienaar's emphasis on academic study, because for me this implies only drawing from sources of higher education, where higher might be misinterpreted as knowledges only relating to the hierarchy. And especially in mathematics, there's even hierarchy that exists in the discipline itself in terms of this concept of pure mathematics versus an applied mathematics. And so I'm trying to get away from this idea that I can only learn from certain types of knowledge, and that in fact all knowledges are relevant and useful for different reasons. So for me, I also expanded Pienaar's emphasis then on academic study in relation to Currere. And for me, instead of that concept of academic study, I'm thinking of it as alternative worldviews and trying to study different worldview instead. So what is Currere for my research context? In rephrasing one of Pienaar's descriptions of Currere as a strategy for students of curriculum to study the relations between academic knowledge and life history in the interests of self-understanding and social reconstructions, you'll notice the bottom one, I've actually changed some of the wording. So for me, Currere is a strategy or method that I can use as a student of mathematics curriculum to study the relations between Aboriginal knowledges and my doctoral experiences in the interest of developing an alternative subjectivity as a decolo Indigenous educator and reconstructions of educational curricula, especially mathematics education curriculum. And I'll come back to that term decolo Indigenous towards the end of the presentation and talk about it a little bit more. It's something that's a subjectivity still in process in my mind. So for those of you that came to actually hear about Currere itself and not my research, what is Currere? There's 4 steps or moments to the method. There's a regressive step where you recall or remember past experiences. And these don't have to be personal experiences. Pienaar actually doesn't reflect on many of his experiences in the text. He tends to refer back to history that has happened and go into academic histories. Then in the progressive stage, there's an imagining of future concepts or ways of knowing and being, in my case, is how I think of it. And in the analytical phase, there's an understanding of the present, because you've thought about the past and you've imagined the future, and it helps you to reflect on the place that you're at. And then a synthetical stage, which is a re-entering of that lived present. And for me then, that's related to re-entering the classroom as a decolo Indigenous educator instead of just a mathematics teacher. So in considering the 4 concepts then, they point to a temporal structural of the autobiographical. It's situated. So because I'm drawing on my own experiences, my work then is going to be autoethnographic, related to autobiography, because I seek to understand how Aboriginal worldview, in my case, instead of academic studies, helps me to understand my life, and vice versa, how my life and my experiences help me to understand Aboriginal worldview and how I can challenge the Western ways of thinking that I grew up with. I just had one more quote from Pienaar. "The student of educational experience accepts that at any given moment he or she is located in history and culture, always in a singularly meaningful way." And again, I assume that's because we all have our own experiences that we're drawing from. Even if we read the same historical texts, we usually write about it differently. So the regressive step, the remembering or the recalling of past experiences. In the regressive phase, like I said, you don't necessarily have to recall your own personal experiences, but that's what I find I'm doing with this research. The emphasis here is on the past, but not yet its reconstruction in the present. So trying to just focus on what those past experiences were, or past histories. So in my case, I have a few experiences. One of them was my Master's of Education experience. And as I continued to read in the realm of change and chaos and complexity literature, it was the vocabulary and the notions offered from complexity that I was drawn to. There were flexible understandings of teaching and learning instead of the rigid positivistic definitions that I'd been used to living. Complexity favored understandings of connectivity, relations, interactions, self-organizations, the idea of a collective learning system. Complexity fostered openness and tentativeness. They were words very different from positivistic ways of thinking, and I was able to start to imagine practicing teaching and learning differently than I had been used to. One problem with complexity, though, was that it was actually critiqued as having no moral way of guiding education or ethical way of guiding education because it's considered a descriptive theory of how the environment exists without moral context. So that's something that sat with me all throughout my master's. And as a result, it's something that's been drawn into my doctoral work because without moral guidance for education, it's hard to say how education should function, even if we can create collective learning systems in our classrooms. Whether or not we should is perhaps another question. And I won't go through all the experiences. Another one, though, that's kind of interesting is the second. There's a pivotal moment that I had in ECNI 866. Kathy Nolan was the teacher at the time, and she gave an assignment where we had 13 articles that we were supposed to read. And Indigenizing Mathematics Education was one of the articles. It happened to be the second one listed. And because I'd actually been away from the university for 4 years' time, I decided it best that I read all 13 articles so that I knew what all of the issues were that I could perhaps choose from and think about. And for whatever reason, I still placed the Indigenization of Mathematics Education as the 12th article that I actually read. And I find that experience kind of fascinating because I was actually sort of bored to death as I was reading through most of the other issues. And as I got to that one, I couldn't put it down. And part of it was all of the language that had to do with Aboriginal ways of knowing and thinking completely related to complexity. But there was also an added dimension that they could talk about complexity and relations and still have a moral and ethical component to it as well. So I see it still as something I can develop and perhaps offer back to those that use complexity in education, as maybe Aboriginal ways of knowing can fill that void that they seem to critique complexity for in terms of missing ethical and moral guidance. A thing I keep in mind is I can't change others, but I can work at changing myself. which works with Currere as well, because there's a point in the initial part of Currere, or for most of it, where you really are supposed to look at your own experiences, or historically look at experiences, draw from them, and formulate ideas and concepts yourself, and then take it out in a second phase into community and speak publicly through the word allegory is what Pienaar uses, so sort of a public debate, except not in terms of an actual debate, in terms of more of complicated conversation of, here's some ideas, how can we move forward, or how else can we think about them, not necessarily to say this idea is the right idea and your idea is not. So it's a complicated conversation, and his terms are not about debate. And the last experience is Barton's Trojan horse phenomenon, which I can't ever sort of escape or neglect. It sits as one of those trace experiences in the back of my mind, because Barton did work with Maori, New Zealand, I think in New Zealand, Aboriginal people, and they rewrote the mathematics curriculum in Maori. However, two things I learned from reading his article. One was that it's often impossible to write in one language what's being said in another. And just as, you know, I can try and have Aboriginal understandings of knowledge, but I don't feel like I'll ever have Aboriginal worldview because I don't have the language. And so without language, I'm missing key components. So that's one thing from Barton. Another is that even though the mathematical language in Maori was developed collaboratively with educators and elders, the mathematics education seemed to be a vehicle that led to the subtle corruption of the ethos of the language. And what happened was they were finding on the playground, some students started to use mathematical words because they had meanings now of hierarchy that they didn't have before, and so they were using them in derogatory ways. And so the language had been subtly corrupted by Western ways of thinking. And so I'm trying to be cognizant of those types of things. And even as I look at work then, you know, even something that's not in a Western textbook, but sometimes I'll be looking at work that Aboriginal authors have written, and if I still see Western worldviews, I find I'm at least more aware of that, and I want to try and push to, again, challenge that Western worldview that seems to be this trace existence in some of the work. So the second step is the progressive step. So reimagining future concepts. You look to what is not present. Basically, it's the idea of fantasies and hallucinations, trying to go places where you haven't thought before. And sometimes that can be fairly impossible. But I'm finding, again, by seeking out a different worldview, it helps one to think differently. And so then I can start to reimagine in ways I wasn't able to before. For my progressive step, there's a few things that took me to the place that I'm at. One was this idea of the strategic plan at the University of Regina includes the concept of indigenization. So I took time to research indigenization because I didn't know what it meant, but it helped me to try and start to think differently. So I consider it as part of the progressive step, even though it's something in the end I'm going to shy away from, and I think that comes up later, so I'll explain in a minute. And then the post-anti-decolonization of schooling, that helps me to think about schooling differently than I would have in the present. Ermine's ethical space of engagement, and the framing of peace, especially that concept of radical hope. There's a couple of things that I'd just like to elaborate on. So one is Ermine's ethical space of engagement. And I found this space helpful. He sort of explains this ethical space as being between two worldviews. I just need to pull my... So in the Indigenous education course I took, Willie Ermine drew my attention to this third space as a space between Western and Aboriginal worldviews, a place for reimagining and a potential space for co-constructing new or alternative possibilities, especially in my realm in education. It's actually used in other disciplines such as health and media I've found throughout my work, and it's considered a framework between the two worldviews, a place that we can collaborate and learn to think differently together. And thinking about enacting curriculum as radical hope. The authors, Simts and Nakvi, suggest that peace as radical hope is fundamentally about how we take up responsibility in the world in the face of the precariousness that denies all humans opportunities for better lives. They suggest we follow Lear's notion of radical hope as requiring certain ways of being and acting in the world with a sense of oneself as a person who is undeniably linked with others through bonds of caring and responsibility. So here, radical hope is actually understood by Lear as directed towards a future goodness that transcends the current ability to understand what it is. And so I found those words helpful in trying to reimagine what education might look like. Then we come to the third step. Again, it's the analytical step, trying to understand the present by considering your future thoughts and your past experiences. And in here, in the second quote, I've underlined the term bracketing. It says, we attempt to discern how the past adheres in the present, and in our fantasies of the future. The analysis of Currere is akin to phenomenological bracketing, one's distantiation from the past and extrication from the future functions to create a third space of freedom in the present. Now, bracketing, though, when I looked it up in more detail, is considered a methodological device of phenomenological inquiry that requires deliberately putting aside one's own belief about the phenomenon under investigation. And of course, that type of work has actually been critiqued because we can't necessarily bracket ourselves from the way that we think. They go on, the three researchers, Chan, Fung, and Chen, go on to say that it's not humanly possible for qualitative researchers to be totally objective, which is why I'm not happy with that second quote. But similarly, Marshall also discusses Foucault's notion of stepping back, for those of you that read Foucault, or perhaps you can relate to Foucault instead. It's the ability to detach oneself from what one sees so as to establish an object of thought and to be able to reflect upon a problem. So, though one perhaps can't bracket, I think one can step back, and I need to be able to step back from my Western worldview when understanding a couple of ideas. One from Mi'kmaq elder Alex Denny's phrase, "You can't be the doctor if you're the disease." And from Audre Lorde's speech titled, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." If I can't step back or somehow challenge Western ways of thinking, I can't use Western ways of thinking to, in my mind, change the way the current educational system is, leaving Aboriginal knowledge absent. So I have to find a way to step back. And no matter what you want to call it, whether you call it bracketing or stepping back, I seem to be able to find a way to challenge my Western worldview or find a third space for thinking otherwise and reimagining curricular possibilities when my Western worldview is disrupted by conflicting Aboriginal and Indigenous knowledges. So I'm tentative to suggest that the Western worldview is disrupted by Aboriginal Indigenous worldview, as I said, because I don't believe I can fully understand the worldview, but the knowledges help to make snags or tears in my Western ways of thinking, which I can then use. So Thomas King's description of the dead Indian is something that I was able to relate to in this analytical step. And I'll just share it with you because it relates to the curriculum outcome that we looked at and to this textbook question. So what I was trying to do was figure out from my past experiences, from thinking ahead, using the analytical step, why is it that Western worldview omits Aboriginal knowledge even though it tries to include Aboriginal content? And I probably wouldn't have come to this idea without having read Thomas King and his description of the dead Indian. So I just want to explain how Aboriginal knowledges and reading Aboriginal authors helps to disrupt my Western ways of thinking. So from his book, The Inconvenient Indian, the notion of the dead Indian as North America's conjures construction is most helpful. King says, you can find dead Indians everywhere because they are the only antiquity that North America has. Europe has Greece and Rome. China has the powerful dynasties. Russia has the Cossacks. South and Central Americas have the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Maya. But North America has dead Indians. Whites have been comfortable with dead Indians. If you like the West and you are an outdoors type person, you can run out to Wyoming and pedal your bicycle over Dead Indian Pass, spend the evening at Dead Indian Campground, and in the morning cycle across Dead Indian Meadows on your way to Dead Indian Peak. Sometimes you can only watch and marvel at the way in which the dead Indian has been turned into products such as Red Chief Sugar, the Atlanta Braves, Redmond Tobacco, Jeep Cherokee, and Tomahawk missiles. But all of this pales in comparison with the contemporary entrepreneurs who have made a bull market business out of dead Indian culture and spirituality. Gone are the bogus potions and rubs that marked the earlier snake oil period. They've been replaced by books that illuminate alternative dead Indian reality, by workshops that promise an authentic dead Indian experience, by naked therapy sessions in a sweat lodge or a teepee that guarantee to expand your consciousness and connect to your inner dead Indian. It was this passage that made me be able to think about my work differently and that curriculum and textbook information differently. So it got me thinking about perhaps how a dead teepee has been conjured by white North America and is being used in mathematics education. So since education is presently considered as a business anyways, I was able to link the idea of the contemporary entrepreneurs from King's book to the idea of mathematics educators and the idea of a bull market enterprise to perhaps the mathematics curriculum. So why not the dead Indian concept to the dead teepee concept in mathematics education? It was difficult for me to argue that the representation of the teepee in mathematics could be anything otherwise in those particular questions once I understood that Aboriginal knowledges talk about the teepee as being the domain of the woman and the gift of the Creator, and that each teepee pole represents a First Nations law or teaching that is completely absent from those documents. So then in the synthetical step, the final step, it's the concept of reactivating the past, understanding the present, and finding, I think, a different future than the trajectory we're on. And here also is where this idea that once I've done this analysis and come to some formulations and considerations on my own, I need to take it out into the public and try and invite people to have complicated conversations about these things in terms of how could we use then an alive teepee and the actual teachings in mathematics education instead of the representations that we have. So I mentioned this before, but I'll just say it again. To dissociate Currere from discussion, that idea of complicated conversation is used. The curriculum itself is considered an ongoing, complicated conversation with the idea that there's no truth to be discovered and no conclusion sought. In this way, the key curriculum question is always what knowledge or knowledges are of most worth. And perhaps it's an ongoing question, depending on the immediacy of the historical moment, the particularity of the place, and the singularity of one's own individuality that becomes articulated through the subject matter, such in my case in mathematics. I'm obviously asking different questions than other people would be asking. So in my synthetical step then, I come back to the idea of this decolo-indigenous educator subjectivity. In grappling with Aboriginal knowledges so as to generate disruptions of my Western worldview, I've been trying to find a way to describe without limiting the definition of what it is that I'm trying to do or the subjectivity I'm creating. And I started out with these two words. In fact, I guess I started out here trying to figure out what indigenization was, then came to the understanding, especially from listening to Yves Tuck's presentation and in taking Carol's class, it's been helpful. Obviously, decolonization has to be part of my work, especially as a non-Aboriginal person. I need to spend my time mostly disrupting Western worldview. But what happened when I was trying to use these two words is a few Aboriginal people have said to me that indigenization is not a great word. And in fact, for some of them, they've said this type of example is an example of indigenization. It's sort of, in my mind, a fancy word that's been created. I'd actually like to interview a couple of students. Apparently in one of my other classes, there were students that helped with the creation of the strategic plan, and so I'm curious where that word came from and how many people were consulted or who was consulted. So with that understanding that this word isn't maybe quite right, I happen to actually, even in, I guess I'm jumping ahead of myself. So I started to think like this though, that I wanted to have both parts present when I was thinking about the subjectivity I'm trying to create. And I feel like decolonizing has to come first because the Western ways of thinking have to be disrupted first, but I can make space for Indigenous ways of knowing to help me do those disruptions and then to help make better integrations into the curriculum. But when I presented this in class, one of my peers said, you know, that word indigenization was just bugging them. And we happened to, this was actually just 10 days ago in Carol's class. And luckily, we just read an article that talked about indigenism. And so he helped me move from this concept of indigenization to indigenism, thinking of it as in terms of feminism, and that I could be indigenous, just like Paul can, poor Paul, I keep picking on him, but he's the only guy in the room, just like Paul can be feminist without having to be female. And so I then have moved beyond these constructions, beyond the binary construction, beyond making space using words that perhaps aren't as appropriate, to this type of construction now is decolo-indigenous, as a way of thinking about always having to disrupt Western worldview. And the only other thing is this idea then with the teepee and how it might be used what I find is that it's challenging my whole way of thinking about mathematics completely and the artificialness of mathematics, for lack of a better way of saying it. So in grappling, sorry, my thing moved on me. So there's a professor in mathematics, and I'm referring to this bottom part here, paralleling the work of Munir Fashi. There's a professor in mathematics, Fashi, who describes his educational experience. He's actually a mathematician with a PhD in mathematics, as pulling him from what was real and putting him into what is an artificial world, claiming that it is progress. And it was the main experience of his life as he grew up all the way through to the doctoral level. Then, there was an intellectual earthquake in his life that shattered illusions and myths, an earthquake that shook the foundation of his academic understanding of mathematics and liberated him at many levels when he recognized that his illiterate mother knew and practiced mathematics in a way he was unable to comprehend. Whereas his mathematics was dogmatically precise, hers was flexibly precise. Whereas his knowledge claimed to be universal, hers formed a harmonious universe rooted in life and community. His mind was so colonized that he says he realized when he realized his mother's mathematics, the first thing he wanted to do was to show her how he was thinking. But then he says, he wanted to be able to find a synthesis between his mathematics and hers, but he soon realized that would be like putting real flowers with plastic flowers in a vase. And he realized his obligation in her case was to preserve the situation the way it was, and that interference to change it would have been an act of violence. So what's interesting is his mother was a dressmaker, and people would come to her with material and with a picture, but she wouldn't use a pattern. She might take a few mathematical measurements, the way we think of it, but then she would be able to make these fabulous dresses without patterns. And so he knew mathematics was being used, but not in the artificial way that we try and teach to students. And so it brings me back to the teepee, that yes, it has mathematical components, but it's got a lot more that's completely being left out, and it's like the dressmaking that should probably be preserved as is. And in talking to Edward Doolittle, I'm starting to be able to formulate it as there's an embodied type of mathematics that students are completely not having access to, which would be an interesting change to our educational system. So I think I've done what I was supposed to do and brought the discussion out to the forefront instead of keeping it to myself through allegory. Thanks for coming, Gail. No, feel free to email me any comments or questions if you have anything. Okay. The only other thing I think I need to mention is Musil reminds that these steps do not occur in a discrete temporal sequence, but kind of simultaneously. And I would actually say that for me, this experience hasn't been in a step-like fashion, even though I was trying to be able to present it like that today. And it hasn't been simultaneous either. In fact, it's been something that's been building and shifting and changing over the last year and a half. So it's difficult to find ways to describe something that's complex, and neither linear nor simultaneous seems to be working. But that's all I have to work with. So, any other questions then?
I have a couple of things that I'd like to not necessarily ask you, because you're still in the proposal stage and stuff. The first thing, pre-proposal.
Yeah, it's actually pre-proposal,
so
although it looks like
this is a good
research.
thing to think about. You know, when you were talking about that last author, Munir,
Yes.
and about embodied math. And my grandma, and I tell this example to all my students about my grandmother, who was considered as print-based illiterate in Canada, but in Zanzibar, she was a very respected elder, and she could read coconuts to tell when they were ready for coconut water, when they were ready for the flesh to be harvested to make coconut milk,
Yeah.
when the husks were ready to make mats and baskets with, and she could read the tide. She could read. I'm a Muslim, and she's a Muslim, and she could read the sun 5 times a day
Right.
to tell her when it was time to stop, whether it was in the coconut grove or wherever she was to stop and pray, because she didn't have a clock or anything like that. So she was able to do all those things, and I use literacies to engage in those practices. Yet, because of moving into an industrial modern town, Dar es Salaam, we moved away from Zanzibar to the mainland. And in Dar es Salaam, we were then confronted with, because a colonized state, colonized country by the British, German, and Portuguese, there were different ways of doing and knowing. So I never learned, or my mother never learned, or her sister never learned how to do the same literacy practices that my grandmother did. So that so maybe when you talk about embodiedness, I keep thinking that we can't instill embodiedness in a classroom space. It actually has to be nurtured and scaffolded over time, and possibly through oral. You've got to learn how to look at it several times or millions of times.
You have
or
to
whatever.
experience it, or
Exactly.
participation is the word.
So how then will you use that stuff about embodied mathematics? Because I can't see it in our world today. So that maybe Angelina might have inherited or learned through experiential tasks, ways of being that we will not be able to do in the classroom.
What about pre-K to, really, really early and having it develop all the way through?
Right. So how does somebody who is not brought up in indigenous ways of knowing and being then scaffold that with little children?
I don't think it's a quick answer,
No,
because
but
you
it's
can't
something to
get it
think
from
about.
the
It's
books.
something to problematize.
But it helped, like when I went out to a culture camp, to then start to experience some of the things. And I know how to read the clouds that were down there because I have a cabin nearby. And I know which clouds I have to pay attention to in terms of it raining on us. And, I had peers there, it's going to rain. I'm like, no, those ones are across the lake. We don't have to worry about that. So the only way I think you can do it is to get kids out of the classroom. But why we think that we have to try and pull an embodied way in, I don't think it's going to work. We have to, my challenge is we have to stop doing what we're doing.
How do we do it?
And try and do
Start to
something
think,
differently. Yeah.
Because I think I think this is what you're doing is very honorable and respectable and very needed in our society today. But I'd like you to sort of problematize some of the things that you're going to be working with. So it's not to take it out of your dissertation.
No. Yeah.
What you want to do. But
Embellish it
start
more.
to problematize
Yeah.
on that level. And the same thing with Thomas King. Angelina, I don't know about you, but I don't trust much of what Thomas King writes.
I feel like that's the stage I'm at too, is not necessarily at the what are we going to do next, but trying to challenge as many people as I can with this type of presentation. Like I've used it in a couple of pre-service in-teacher classes now to say, here's what's in your textbook. If you think about it like this, should you be doing this? What else could you be doing instead with students? So just starting to ask the questions. They're almost to the point where but we're going into the schools, and like you say, that the school system works this way, and I don't know if we can change it, but I feel like we have to at least start having the conversations so that when they are administrators, maybe they will have more flexibility and more room because they've seen presentations like this or been made to think about embodied mathematics instead of only artificial textbook mathematics. So, yeah.
I like your idea of sort of giving yourself permission to play with concepts. But one thing that frustrates me about trying to read Deleuze and Guattari,
The
they
machine.
try to drive you crazy is what they do. Deleuze in particular, and it's because they use existing concepts
Yeah.
in totally different ways, right? I like the idea of, like Cynthia Dillard, like you said something about Cynthia Dillard, that wrote an article called, a black scholar in the United States. If the music changes, so will the dance, so must the dance.
Well, and I think I can't ignore the language because I
Right.
only knew positivistic
Yeah.
language. The complex language pulled me in. The
Yeah.
Aboriginal language, I'm not using the Aboriginal language, but at least the understandings.
Yeah,
But even, I am starting to try and write with some Aboriginal language as well.
that's why I went after
When I
Patty later
can.
and I said, why
Yeah.
do you still use
Because
validity?
you have to change the language.
Change the language,
Yeah.
to change the discourse.
Yeah.
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 So I like this idea of playing, it makes you think, and that's what,
Well, and it helped.
Thomas
Like
King
if
stuff.
I hadn't,
if you don't like it, yeah, but it certainly makes me think,
yeah.
and I like the things that really make me think.
But it has to be shared too. Like I only got to this step, right? Or like here and then until I presented it, I couldn't get to the feminist analogy and
Yeah.
Indigenous analogy, which is far more useful for
Yes.
me. So until I, collaborated, I couldn't get there by myself. Yeah.
I like the emphasis on the decolonization, and it's related to the tokenism that you're talking about in
Yeah.
decolonization. Because when our system, the way our curriculum is set up, it's all compartmentalized, but the Indigenous way of thinking is more holistic, and that brings all the
Yeah.
aspects. So how do you do that in the system that exists?
Yeah. Basically, we have to disrupt the system,
has to
which
be
is what I'm
decolonized
trying to sort of
Before it can be
get at. Yeah.
But I mean, taking kids outside, I mean,
Yeah.
in environmental education, we've been trying to disrupt the dominant worldview for 25,
That you only learn
50
in a
years.
classroom. Yeah.
So we would identify with that.
Yeah.
And it's natural.
Yeah.
It's not forced. It's not. But I always said that environmental education needs to start in early childhood education. It's got to move through from very young children. If we learn anything from Uri Bronfenbrenner's work about constructing how we come to construct ourselves as certain things, it starts early.
Yeah.
The functional
Yeah.
cosmology of the universe is.
If we didn't tamper with kids, we'd probably be a
I
lot
think it's
further
it's a
along.
nice,
Yeah.
and it's a nice
Yeah.
gentle approach because, she said something that took me back to Ricky Nelson in the 1960s or something. Like that song Garden Party, you can't change everyone, so you got to change yourself.
Well,
So
and I don't
rather than
know.
telling people what to do,
Yeah.
Do it yourself.
do it
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also don't see how you can change a system without changing yourself either. So I might as well start here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yes? Okay, I was also thinking about your own identity and how working in these ways affects your identity, and how the type of knowledges that you have to relearn, because you've learned in one way, now you have to sort of relearn them in a different way, and because identity is never stable, it's always in flux. And you quoted Ermine talking about the ethical space of engagement, where Western knowledges and Indigenous knowledges, and then the ethical space is the third space, considered as a third space. And I'm thinking that the ethical space in itself, so if you're going to use Ermine and to think of what I've just said to you, then I think that ethical space cannot happen unless there's criticality in there. And it cannot also happen unless there's some intercultural understanding going on
Yes.
between the two spaces. And so I think you might want to take a look at that when you're starting to talk about your own
How the shift, yeah.
Yes, but.
'Cause you're right,
there-
I
there can't
couldn't-
not be,
I
so-
couldn't disrupt or, yeah, even think I was entering that until I took classes
Right.
and started to read more. You're right, I have to have
But you have to
an
have the
understanding.
criticality all the time
Yeah.
in there,
Yeah.
positioned in there. Otherwise, it sort of then becomes again facile, just very at the surface level of
Right,
you know.
okay.
So, yeah, that's, and I would take, Thomas King, I mean, if you have to use him, you have to use him, but I don't trust any of his work.
It's not about
So-
trusting though. All it did was disrupt the way of
Okay.
thinking and provide a nice analogy.
Okay.
It's not about whether he's, again, that comes back to the hierarchical scholarly thinking of one person, and just because somebody else writes it's not scholarly, and I don't know that I agree with that, but that's okay.
I'm not saying he's not
Oh,
scholarly.
okay.
I'm just not, because of who he is and the way he has, the way he writes about the peoples of First Nations, and in many ways, many of us think he's sold out, and so, and he's using different interpretations of history to write about. So you need to read some of his stuff, or talk to some Indigenous scholars about Thomas King if you're using quite, if you're using a lot of it. If you're just using a little bit, I think it's okay, but
Okay.
yeah.
We are out of
I'm
time.
We are.
interested, I'm very interested in your
Yeah,
Thank you.
very good.
Thanks.
So let's thank our speaker.
Yes. It's great, an opportunity you provide for PhD students in particular, because I always say to them, and that's why we do what we do in my class, is that every time they get a chance to articulate their ideas to different people, new audiences and so
Yeah.
on. It's like
Part of their
gold.
research.
That's
Yeah.
right, it's exactly, yeah.
Well, and having the presentation forced me to actually write down all the experiences, like just to formulate everything. It's all, yeah, and talking about it and having your feedback is helpful, because I'm never sure if I'm going in a good direction, but at the same time, it feels like I'm challenging appropriately, so.